Hello and welcome to another episode of the CG Garage. This is episode number 281, which, Kristen, is a prime number, believe it or not. And
Oh,
so, and that is completely by accident. But it is relevant to our guest, who is Andy Lomas, who is an artist and lecturer in creative computing. Andy is a fascinating person and a true math geek like myself, right, Kristen?
oh yeah, you guys are math and filmmaking. I said is your jam.
That's yeah. Yep.
hmm
Yeah. He's a pretty cool guy. He's actually in the UK. Again, this is pretty interesting and cool that now we're opening up the podcast to a lot more remote locations by obligation, but also cool that we can do it with Andy, while he's in the UK and still had a really great podcast together. And the video worked out pretty well too. So, he was showing me all of his amazing artwork that he's done, which is really great. What are some of the cool takeaways that you got from this podcast?
well, I thought it was interesting. So after he graduated from Cambridge, he went on to visual effects and got to work on some of the Matrix movies, which was awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And he was one of the lead developers of Katana.
That's true. And he worked at the
And then
foundry as well and was
yeah,
developing the foundry, Katana at the foundry. He's no longer at the foundry. He's sort of become an independent CG artist, right? And
mhm.
what do you think about that stuff?
So he has like the cool CG artwork that he does, and he makes it through deep learning and then NVIDIA's Optic X API. So
Yeah.
he creates like plant-like and cellular forms.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, oh, it's so confusing, but he brings together influences from like nature, physics, and biology. So really interesting, really cool.
Yeah.
And then also in the podcast post, we'll have the talk about his paper that Understanding Aesthetic Evaluation, Learning Deep Learning that him
Right.
and John McCormack wrote. And then there's also a video that's
Yeah,
linked to that. Mhm.
it's a really cool podcast. Research paper that he did because it's about using deep learning to evaluate aesthetic decision making, and it's basically saying teaching a computer how to like things or not like things, or
Yeah.
what you like. Because if you have to go through thousands and thousands and thousands of images and say I like this, I don't like this, which is kind of one of the things we get into, the computer will help you get filter through that stuff pretty easily through deep learning. It's actually fascinating talk and a really great talk, a really great paper, and we go through it extensively with Andy. And I think it's important because honestly speaking, there's so many things that are on the internet that our people, our customers make, and just the idea of having something that is figuring out what is attractive in a weird way,
Mhm.
or what makes an interesting image is an interesting paper to write as well. We have a ton of announcements, right?
Yeah, we do. All right, so you can find all these out at chaosgroup.com. So the big one is we announced last week, V-Ray 5 for 3ds Max is now available, so you can get that.
Yep.
And then our update, another one is Phoenix FD4 Update 2 is now available, and it's compatible with 3ds Max 2021 and V-Ray 5.
Yeah, and very important that you guys get that. If you guys are using Phoenix FD, you will need that update in order to take advantage of V-Ray 5. I learned it the hard way myself. So you need to basically make sure you get that update because then all of your V-Ray 5 stuff will be nicely accelerated and it'll be very compatible with Phoenix. So make sure you get that as well. And then a couple other ones as well.
Yes, V-Ray for Unreal Update 3,
Yep.
and then we have the V-Ray 5 for Maya Beta is now available,
Yep.
and then the last is our V-Ray collection, which we announced last week as well.
Yeah, V-Rec Collections is a big deal. Basically, we're offering a collection where you can buy basically all the licenses of V-Ray for all the different platforms, and then V-Rec Phoenix FD as well. You'll also get all of those, and then you'll get Project Lavina. You'll get some cloud credits. You'll also get V-Ray scans, all in one collection. So it's basically like our universal license that contains everything, which is pretty great. Definitely worth checking out if you guys are big V-Ray users and want to use it across different platforms. This is a really good solution for all of you guys, as well as getting access to Phoenix and all the other stuff. So really cool. Okay, cool. And let's just, if people want to know more about this podcast, where can they go?
You can go to facebook.com/CG Garage Podcast or chaosgroup.com/cggarage.
And of course, we will always take more suggestions on some cool guests that we would like to have. As you guys know, we are reaching out a much wider net across the entire globe now, not just places where I am or going to be, since I'm just stuck at home and like everyone else. So definitely let us know. We'd love to get your suggestions. labs@chaosgroup.com is where you can email us and just let us know what your thoughts are. I would also say that, reminder that these are video podcasts now as well. The video podcast is up on our Facebook page, as we mentioned before. That's facebook.com/CG Garage Podcast. But it's also available on our YouTube channel for Chaos Group. So just look up Chaos Group TV on our YouTube channel, and all of our podcasts are in video form there. For this particular podcast, believe it or not, it's actually important because Andy was in his office, and he had all these 3D prints of some of the sculptures he had been doing that he was showing me. So if you guys want to see what he's talking about, you guys need to check out the video form as well. All right, guys. Hopefully you'll enjoy this amazing podcast with Mr. Andy Lomas.
Welcome to another CG Garage, where the Chaos Group talks. You'll know it's over when the last bucket drops. We're gonna fire off rays in high dynamic range. We know that ambient occlusion is passe. Global illumination won't lead you astray. And while image-based lighting is really swell, you need to make sure everything has Fresnel.
So, Andy, I am drinking out of a mug that is, let's see if you can see it, close to
that's
30,
better,
30 years old. It's the old Mathematica mug that my
that's good knot on there by the looks of it. Good genuine knot.
yeah. So I was a math major in undergraduate, and my math professor gave me this mug as something that I was going to be for my graduation, because my first foray into computer graphics was actually trying to figure out multidimensional space on a Next machine using Mathematica.
Okay, all right, yeah.
That's what got me into computer graphics. Believe it or not, was actually mathematical objects. So I think this is very inspirational to me. So I would love to know your background and how did your math and art come together as well at some point.
Oh, it's a long and twisted road.
Really?
But, yeah, I guess I do come from a math background originally. That I guess my undergraduate years were spent doing maths. Basically, I did study maths at Cambridge back in the 80s. So you can see quite a lot of grey hairs probably there. That was quite a long time ago. And I guess when I was there, I got quite into what's called dynamical systems, which is, I guess, the whole maths of things that feed back into themselves, things that get iterated, basically the non-linear, interesting function things. So it's basically the branch of maths that things like chaos theory and things like that are
like fractals and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's about the dynamical nature of things, where you sort of take the result and you feed it back into yourself again and again and again and again, where you often get these crazily complex sort of things happening. And so I guess that was sort of the area of maths that I was most interested in. And I guess then I also...
Was it the visuals that interested you about it?
I think more just this idea of the astounding richness that you can get from such simple functions. I mean, the Mandelbrot set is sort of a classic one where it's almost like the simplest nonlinear function you can always come up with. Almost just like, take a value and just keep on squaring it and adding to itself and squaring it and adding to itself. So it's almost like, as something that's nonlinear, it's about as simple as it could be. Right. And yet it makes the Mandelbrot set. It's sort of just like, it's sort of... and I guess that was that. I was always interested in the idea of almost like, could maths be used in biology and things like that? And I just read this book there's a Scottish zoologist and philosopher and mathematician called Darcy Wentworth Thompson, who's, if you're visualizing like this old guy with a great big long beard and things like that, you've got it absolutely sort of dead on. So it's basically this sort of Scottish guy who wrote a book over 100 years ago
Uh-huh.
called On Growth and Form, which I guess back then was the crazy idea that maths was actually relevant to biology. It was about the maths behind and the physics behind things like shells growing and structures that are built where it was like you take this form that's grown so far and then you grow more and then you grow more and then you grow
Yeah.
more, but it still has to follow the rules of physics. Hell has to follow, it can't just be assembled by, like the way buildings are built. It has to be, always viable,
Right.
as it's during its process of growth, which then constrains what it can do, but also results in maybe the amazing structures we see in things like, plants and seashells and things like that. So I
Right.
guess I was studying dynamical systems, then reading this dangerous book from over 100 years ago, and it sort of the two went together.
Uh-huh.
And I guess I was also interested in like imagery and film photography. I mean, as far as my tutor's concerned, I probably wasted far too much time. I was very much involved in like the university
Yeah.
filmmaking society, so I spent far much too much time. I probably should have been studying more maths, going out with video cameras and filming things, and then getting time in editing suites and putting together like videos of friends in bands for almost like pop promo videos and things like that. So and
But
then
that's fun though. I think
yeah,
the
yeah,
fact that
exactly.
you
Yeah.
had to exercise both
Mhm.
sides of your brain in some ways.
Yeah. And you then they can combine together. Yeah. So it's
I
sort of
did it. I was very blunt
mm,
about it in school.
mhm.
I was a double major in math and art. So I told them, I was like, I'm doing both.
Okay. Right. Yeah.
And so my math became more creative and my art became more rigorous.
Unfortunately, they don't. They didn't, and I'm sure they probably still don't offer programs like that at
Yeah, yeah.
Cambridge. Right? And
Yeah.
also, I guess the UK's education system tends to be much more like, here's the narrow channel that
Yep.
you will go down.
Right, right, right.
Uh, but I guess I've now found the enclave where you can combine the two. I mean, I'm now actually lecturing part time at a university called Goldsmiths in London,
Hmm.
which is a pretty weird university because
Okay.
it was like originally an art college,
Yeah.
and then it became a full university,
Yeah.
and now has a full computer science department, which actually does quite a lot of research into artificial intelligence and machine learning, things like
Hmm.
that, but also has a huge art side to it. So it
Right.
actually, has programs in computational art, and which is what I'm
Right.
mostly involved in.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, I maybe found the enclave where you can put together, maths and computing and art, and it's not only accepted, they even pay you for it.
yeah. Good for you. We'll get
Right.
to that. We'll get to that because I think we're
Yeah.
skipping a few parts of your history that
Yeah,
leads us
yeah,
right to get
but
there. But
okay,
yes, you're
we'll
right.
back into the story. So
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah. So that
uh,
was so okay. So you're at Cambridge and you're making
mhm,
films and doing math at the same time.
yeah, and reading books by crazy Scotsmen.
Yeah.
I guess I also read papers by crazy English people like Alan Turing, and we were again
Right.
that idea of incredibly simple functions or incredibly simple machines,
Hmm.
but can make astonishingly complicated things, which is, I
Yeah.
guess, that's a common theme.
Yeah.
Uh, so I guess as I left college, and I guess I did the obvious thing with a degree in maths, which I joined with another friend who also had the degree in maths,
Hmm.
and when we met someone else who had a degree in film and video and theatre, and we set up a small video production company. So I did that for about 3 years,
Oh wow.
just like with genuine, video cameras and hiring out TV studios
Okay.
and stuff like that and things, and making training videos for Ford Motor Company and things like that.
Okay. Yeah.
And then I finally put two and two together. Actually, we got given a computer. This goes back in the 1980s, where just having a decent computer at all was pretty remarkable.
Right.
We were actually given a computer by winning this like the regional finals of this young people in business competition, and one of the prizes was, here's a computer. You had to write, what do you use a computer for in your company? And we wrote
Okay.
about what we would use a computer for. We got one which actually could do quite a lot of graphics, thing called the Acorn, the Archimedes.
Okay.
And then I finally just almost like put two and two together. I was like, ooh, computer graphics.
There
That's a
you
way
go.
of combining this stuff.
Right.
So yeah, then did a master's in computer graphics animation, and then sort of got into the crazy world, which I think you know about very
Yeah.
well, the film and video industry.
Right.
So mhm,
Yeah. So you did a lot of work, obviously. You've done a lot of work in the visual effects world as well. Or some of the stuff you were doing. You're one of the main people responsible for Katana, as far as I know as well, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess it's Steve Levites and the
Right.
guys at Sony. Give them full credit that they were the real founding fathers of Katana. But I guess I was hearing about Katana. I worked at a company called ESC
Yeah.
In California, in the Bay Area.
In the Bay Area, yeah. Working on the
where
Matrix, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, working on Matrix 2 and 3, and then
Mhm.
we worked on some other films after that as well. But it's
Right.
this sort of Skunk Works, crazy computer graphics and visual effects company,
Yeah.
which was basically half owned by the Wachowskis, half owned by the Warner Brothers,
Yep.
set up to do Matrix 2 and 3.
Yep.
And I guess I was involved in doing quite a lot of crazy, almost like doing things on the rendering side, almost like how can we pull together all our assets and do I wrote these crazy sort of called geometry shader things,
Mm-hmm.
to which a lot of our pipeline for some of our more complex shots became based around these crazy geometry shader things that I'd written for pulling together assets and then processing and overriding and modifying things before actually whilst they were getting rendered.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
I had some friends at Sony who were sort of pinging me for a while, going, we got this crazy thing here called Katana. It's a bit like this thing called some of the crazy ideas we had at
Right.
ESC. And then I heard that Sony had sold the commercial rights to Katana to the Foundry. So I think I accidentally talked myself into a job at their Christmas party where I was going, You've got Katana. What are you going to do with Katana? Katana's really interesting. What are you going to do with Katana?
Right.
And they eventually
Right.
come, Andy, how about you join us and do some things with Katana?
Right.
So I joined the Foundry to do things with Katana.
That's really cool. That's really cool. Yeah. I mean, I was the last show at Sony that was using burps at the time, and it was, boy, was it archaic. And so
I've heard about that.
Yeah, I was saying,
feel your pain.
Yeah, Katana definitely seemed like a way better option than burps at the time, and I envied those who were using it. But it's a really cool program. Obviously, it's what's also interesting. I mean, actually, I did a podcast recently with Jodie Madden, actually, believe it or not.
All right. Yeah.
And so I was talking about Katana, and I said, oh, what's really interesting about it is that it's being used in ways that I didn't expect, but it totally makes sense. For example, the automotive industry loves it because you can put enormous amount of different states of cars together as a system in Katana. So that's really pretty cool little idea. Yeah. Okay, so you're at the Foundry, and you're working at the Foundry for a while, but then I think somehow you started to get really interested in art and doing that kind of stuff, right?
Well, I guess that goes back way back. I mean, I was always sort of interested in doing my own little things. So even back in I guess I joined Framestore in London back in about '93, I think I remember. But I was still doing my own little crazy things on the side, for use the Silicon Graphics computers for doing genetically programmed things, doing crazy stuff and things. And then also when I was at ESC, I was I got time pretty after actually finishing work on Matrix 3, where we had this huge render farm, and I sort of managed to persuade them not to quite switch off all the machines they were planning to, because we were carrying on working on other films, but we didn't need quite as big a render farm. So I got an allocation to carry on doing some of my crazy experiments and things like that.
Wow.
So I was doing things alongside, and then worked at DreamWorks for a bit, and actually my first stuff shown at the SIGGRAPH and the art gallery was actually whilst I was working at DreamWorks and things. So I was sort of doing stuff alongside, and partly it was almost like a running joke for many years with me and some friends, where it's almost like doing all the things you're not allowed to do in production, where you so it's always, which is quite a nice sort of way of sort of focusing and making it fun. It's sort of like doing stuff that's deliberately out of control, doing stuff where if I got a note from a review session saying that's great, but could you change this and this and this, I would just go, no, I've got no idea how to change that to make it do what you're asking to do it. I mean, it's almost like that's the whole point. It's sort of got to be meant to be ridiculously intricate, complex, but rich and genuinely surprising me.
Right.
And maybe I can sort of understand why it's done something when I see the result, but I've got no idea how to control it to make it do, exactly what I want. Which obviously is the whole game almost always in professional visual effects. Being professional generally is doing rich, complex, amazing, but totally under control.
Right.
Totally, any note that comes from the VFX supervisor, the art director, the director, saying keep everything the same but change that one thing. You know exactly how to do it. So you've over-engineered everything to a ludicrous degree, so that you can change anything they may ask for in any way. That's what you're hoping for.
That's why we art direct skies in visual effects, which you can't do in real life.
Tweak anything. Yeah, exactly. Because you can. Right. And because they're going to ask you to do that. Yep. And if you've done something and then you say they ask you to do something and you go, no, then no one's going to be pleased with you.
Right.
So it was almost my own work was the after opposite. It was this is me with my computer, just deliberately using it almost as a canvas for the unexpected,
right.
But rich, organic. I don't want just random. I want stuff which has unexpected, rich structure. I guess is one of my big things.
Yeah.
Which I guess is the sort of thing that nature has in spades. It's sort of like how do we end up with and also I think we're psychologically attuned to the things in nature.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something human about looking at certain types of organic, crazy complexity,
right,
which have an effect on us. Like watching clouds. Yeah, like going out into a forest and how rich the fields, or wind blowing through a field, and all those sorts of things where
growth
things that
of
make
ferns.
us go
growth of ferns and how their leaves look and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then you have filling this environment, and you go what are the places where you want to hang out,
right? Yeah.
So, and can we make use of almost the same sort of ingredients in a computer?
Mm-hmm.
And often it has this almost like difficult relationship with control, that the more you want those things to basically be more like process and rule based, the more difficult it can be to control those. And I guess I've gone a bit sort of full circle. That's sort of like I'm now actually one of the even more interesting point maybe for me now is almost like there's the joke, let's do something that's totally out of control. Let's do the stuff if James Cameron was directing this film and this was an element in it,
right,
he would be so screwed, because he would ask for it to be modified in that one way, and we got no idea how to do it.
Yeah, that's why I always feel sorry for Houdini artists, because they deal so much with chaos in what they do, and then they're always asked to change one particle, or so it's a simulation.
You end up not re-rendering. You end up going and nuke and just cutting that particle out and putting it over there.
Yeah, just
don't change anything else.
Yeah, I know.
You just fake it.
I know. It's just very. I know exactly what you mean. Like I said, I am very sympathetic towards it, but at the same time, I completely understand your idea of beauty and simplicity. I was like I said, I was doing math and art at the same time, and I would sort of integrate some of my math in my art, and bring some of my art into my math. Believe it or not, somehow I figured out how to do that. I used to just make my professors giggle about it. But I was
professors would just go, "You're wasting your time."
But
having fun.
It's having fun, right? But I think my professors, especially my math professors, really appreciated the fact that I saw beauty in math, and so they liked that part of it, right? And so I was doing some topology stuff. And I was obsessed with Klein bottles, because they're beautiful and stuff like that. And so I wanted to recreate a Klein bottle, but in 4 dimensions, so that it wouldn't cross itself, right? As we all know,
absolutely, because you can't make a proper Klein bottle in 3D.
You can't make it properly in 3D, so I made it in 3D. So I basically created a Mathematica equation which put it in 3 parts. So it was the head part, and then the other part, and then the loop part. And so it was a long equation in Mathematica to make that happen, but I tried to get it so that, it would go through W space so that it wouldn't cross itself.
Yeah.
And it was clunky.
That's the little bridge into it. Section point.
And it was a clunky equation, and it looked okay. It looked like the traditional Klein bottle we know, but it looked okay. And then I was like, this can't be right. And so I then decided I was going to make another equation, which was basically just a torus that flips itself inside out, right? Because that's basically what a Klein bottle is. And so I have a torus, and it has a pinch into itself to flip itself, basically the combination of a Mobius strip and a torus. And then I used my program in Mathematica that I had developed over the summer, which was a 4-dimensional perspective system, which allowed me to basically create 3D shadows of the 4-dimensional space.
Yeah.
And I moved around my pinched torus. And as I did that, it slowly deformed and turned into a representation of the torus that I wanted. As I was moving through 4D space. And I was like, oh my God, I got the torus. I got the Klein bottle. And so I made this painting of the two equations, one, the very complicated one, and the other one, it was just like 4 lines. And I showed the representation of the Klein bottles, and I was like, look at that. And my art students, fellow students, did not like my art at all. They did not see the beauty that I saw in the equation. But absolutely. So, I know what you mean. Sometimes it's so exciting to see such simple things turn into such beautiful things at the same time, you know? So I can totally get what you mean by that. But you've done your art that I've seen, and I've seen a lot of it, is very generative. It's a lot about the generative process, right? And cellular structures and biology. So how did you combine all of that kind of stuff together? What was some of your inspiration, and how did you sort of figure out what to do?
I guess I'd almost always sort of reinvent the wheel. That they say I'm very bad at. I think lots of people from maths backgrounds is like, I don't forget what anyone else is doing. Let's just invent all this myself. So I guess the whole idea of growth by iteration, particularly almost like growth by. I guess one of my earlier work was more on accumulated growth, which actually there's a quite classic sort of fractal algorithm called diffusion limited aggregation that's almost like accumulating things by randomly, almost like particles, almost like in water, randomly accumulating.
Right.
And that sort of my take on that was what happens if you change the environment? What happens if you sort of influence and bias the system?
Right.
How much do you need to bias it before it sort of starts suddenly folding into different behavior? And then it was like, you sort of, that creates a certain, actually often very coral-like sort of structures.
Right.
Or sort of actually going from coral-like to almost like bacteria growth in Petri dishes and things like that. But there's a sort of classic diffusion limited aggregation range of structures you sort of get.
Right.
And one of the questions was then, why don't you get things like almost like animal-like structures, I guess, particularly almost like internal organs or folded skin or, those sorts of things. So I guess in a treated way of maybe, a more almost like cellular, instead of almost like just accumulating where the food comes from is where the growth happens. More idea of having sheets of cells and cells actually actively growing and modifying. And also I guess there's a really nice sort of mathematical ideas in sort of hyperbolic planes and sort of the idea of surfaces with curvatures that may make this shape of the structure really interestingly, richly complex.
Right.
So the idea, if you've got a growing set of cells, you could grow them in ways which maybe would naturally have these sort of curvatures, which also create almost like tensions in the system. So I guess not diffusion limited aggregation. It's very static sort of forms you go. So the idea of let's have it dynamic. Let's have it, there are tensions in the surface of cells, and things could then hopefully, fold and twist and turn in interesting ways. So it's basically just didn't read any proper biology, just wrote code to just say I've got a concept of a cell, it's linked to other cells around it, it's exerting forces on those cells. I want to actively grow them in ways that hopefully are going to be these sort of almost like rubber sheets they're going to naturally want to fold, so it's a bit like cloth simulation stuff, I guess.
Okay. Now there's forces on these. You must put some kind of forces or arbitrary ideas that create sort of restrictions or manipulations in some way, right?
Yes. Okay. There's things that introduce dynamics. I mean, I guess one thing I also quite like is playing not only fast and loose with biology but also physics.
Right. Exactly.
I actually quite like it. Was like, how different could this be from classic biology? Yeah. What is it going to do? Is it going to be ridiculously, alienly, whoa, that just looks so completely different?
Right.
Or is it going to actually be, the rules are so different, yet it produces the same stuff or makes it really familiar.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of almost art ideas that I'm interested in. So yeah, almost like deliberately not worrying whether the system is an accurate simulation of biology and actually sometimes reveling where, say in physics stuff. So one thing I'm doing is sort of to make things a bit more stable is not doing things as straight force equations. As I'm doing what's usually called that throwing the momentum term away, which
Okay.
is something that potentially makes the system more stable. But though in some ways it's a bit like something being, like a very small thing underwater. It's
Okay.
sort of like where, you know, instead, I mean, it's a traditional approach sometimes done in like cloth simulations to make the system more stable.
Okay.
Um, and it's just like, fine, makes it more stable, makes the code easier, makes
Right,
the
right, right.
simulation more likely to work.
Right, right,
Great.
right.
Totally throw away the momentum term everywhere. So there's things like that where I'm, it's almost like anything to make it so that I guess one of my big things is wanting to get to ridiculous levels of complexity, um, millions, many millions and things like that of units. Something I'm always trying to get to. And I guess it's something I learned, you doing visual effects on films is your techniques. How do you push the systems to be able to at least do several millions of things?
Right.
Um, but in order to get to that point, you generally have to, throw anything away that's going to be complicated to calculate, because, otherwise you're going to get to thousands, you're not going to get to millions. So,
Right, right, right.
you learn the professional craft of throwing everything away that you don't need.
You'd rather do a million small calculations than 1,000 more complicated ones, right?
Yes, exactly. Absolutely, exactly. I mean, it's also been interesting that when I've met obviously there's quite a few people doing almost like similar-ish sort of things, but in proper science, proper almost like trying to do like proper cellular.
Right.
I've got maybe quite a few people in life sciences institutes and things like that, where they're doing as accurate as possible cell growth systems.
Right.
And what's quite fun is comparing, it's sort of what's same and what's different. And like there was a guy up at the um, Life Sciences Institute at the University of Dundee that I sort of talked to quite a lot
Hmm.
recently. And he's a physicist who's on secondment to this Life Sciences Institute. And very much what he's trying to do is like as accurate as possible simulations,
Right.
which means that he can generally only do a few thousand things.
Right.
And he's often trying to look for almost like the typical behavior.
Right.
Whereas what I'm often looking for is saying, unless I can do millions, it's not. There's something I think about an aesthetic response we have to things that are structured but a sufficient level of complexity,
Okay.
which and a threshold. I mean, a rule of thumb I always had when I was working in the industry was you've got to be able to always get to the level of millions before you get to an interesting level of complexity. It does, it goes from looking just like was like chemical models of a protein to
Right.
looking like something rich.
That's
So yeah,
that's
I was always
nice.
going to put it that far,
Now, have you obviously is your work taking advantage of GPUs at this point, because GPUs can do millions of things now, millions of
Yeah,
little things.
or you badly code a GPU and it goes even slower than a normal
Yes,
CPU.
it's true. It's true. It's true. Yeah, but
So yes, I am. I'm actually all my cell growth systems. Actually, I originally coded it all to run on the CPU,
mhm.
and then basically I wanted to get this almost like electrostatic repulsion between cells, sort of
Mhm.
to it's like soft collision things so that things as they fold over, they sort of push each other apart a bit.
Mhm.
And yeah, that's the point where my code just became way too slow. And I
Right.
had a friend who was actually working at NVIDIA who just kept on prodding me, going, Andy, put it on the GPU.
Yeah.
Andy, put it on the GPU.
It seems like it
Eventually,
was ripe for that.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. He was right. And he managed to get me a GPU. So I was like, Andy, there's a GPU. Put it on the GPU.
Yeah,
And I
that's
did it.
amazing.
And it did work. And so it's yeah, I'm quite a fan of massively parallel processing. The idea of having,
Right.
that, and there's rules of thumb with GPU programming. Unless you have at least 10,000 threads, you're wasting your time. You've got to. So you've just gone from like CPU programming where a few tens of threads is like,
Right.
whoa, that's difficult, to GPU programming where I guess actually that you're so restricted what you can do. It's actually a lot easier. than
Right.
general
Right.
CPU thread programming, because
Right.
there's almost everything you could do that make it complicated, you're not allowed to do on the GPU.
Right.
But you've got to write your code to at least be doing like, tens of thousands or hundreds of, or
Yep.
tens of millions or hundreds of millions. You can set off 100 million threads, and
Right.
it's just fine. It's just that's what it's designed to do,
Yep.
which is, hey, a thread per cell. I've got 100 million cells. Great, it can do it.
Wow.
You know,
There you go.
as long as your code, it still has to be written to be efficient enough. But the ability to simulate almost like a biological level of complexity, I guess,
Right.
to my mind, that's what modern. I'm really lucky that I'm alive in a time where these machines, which are, what were huge supercomputers until astonishingly recently,
Yep.
and mainly because of computer games, and now probably as scholars
Yep.
now being pushed for ray tracing and stuff like that, as you
Yep.
guys know. The astonishing power that you have in a GPU,
Yeah.
and they're getting so much faster all the time as well. So it's like, thank you, computer gamers.
Yes.
I'll take those machines, and I've got a very boring machine down there,
Yeah.
which doesn't look nearly. It's not. It is actually a water cooled, reasonably top end dual GPU, water cooling
Yep.
blocks and everything like that in their machine. I haven't got all the LED lights and things like that. I don't care about that. It processes stuff ridiculously fast.
Well, it's it's kind of amazing. NVIDIA's kind enough to loan me a bunch of computers so that I can test our stuff and a bunch of things. I'm actually recording this podcast right now on a Razer laptop, with a 15-inch Razer laptop, and it has a Quadro RTX 5000 in it. and it is under 5 pounds. Under 5 pounds. This thing could run Flame on it. I mean, just the thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's crazy.
Actually, that's one thing when I was, about 10 years ago, when I joined the Foundry, and then, going around with Katana, and that I could, but laptops have got to the point where, I could have a Linux laptop to go around,
Right.
sit in my backpack, and I could run Katana almost every render at reasonably decent speed. I think I did a demo at Sigro, the Foundry party at Sigro, where we had a crowd system, I think, with 50,000 characters.
Wow.
With Katana overriding individual, hats on different, characters in the crowd and things like that, and actually getting that rendering in a live demo in the middle of the party.
It's pretty amazing. Yeah. Wow.
Do it.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And I think it's nice to be able to have that kind of freedom to be able to take that power with you to go, because you're right. It used to be you have to rent supercomputer time, and that was not cool.
Yeah. Well, I still need supercomputers. There is a very nice supercomputer down
right
in the
there.
corner.
Yeah, exactly.
It's basically just gamer level tech.
Yep.
Which is,
It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. I don't know if you've met Scott Eden. Do you know Scott Eden? Have you heard of him at all?
No, I don't think I do. Actually.
You guys are both in London. I'm going to set you guys up on a date, because you are both working.
Well, those dates for now, you have to meet just on Zoom.
No, yeah. Now you have to meet on Zoom. But you guys both are working, doing art and using GPUs and deep learning and a bunch of other things. He does it all with a bunch of work in using human anatomy deep learning process, which is extraordinarily interesting. I think the two of you would really get along and have a great call. So after this, I'll remember. I'm going to set an email up so you guys can exchange some ideas and some stuff. He's also done a bunch of stuff that's been in exhibits as well. But your work has been in galleries and has seen many different forms of art and of the way you've done it. You've done some 3D printing, some images, some quote unquote holograms. What were some of the ways that you decided, here's how I'm going to represent all this work, right?
I guess that's also one thing I'm interested in exploring, is that, what you got is generally this data in the computer.
Right.
But then representing it, materializing it, I guess, as the art speak goes, in different ways. And you actually take very different things from it. I mean, so that's one thing I'm surprised by. It's not just a matter of, I've got the data, now I'm just trying to do something for, put in a gallery. It's actually, by seeing it in VR, by seeing it 3D printed, by seeing it at a printed or there's a 2D, but at a level of resolution that you certainly can't do with 3D printing.
Right.
All these different things bring you start noticing different details. And actually, I've just been working quite recently on using NVIDIA's optics library to. Actually, my own code has my own GPU ray tracing code in it.
Right.
And now, on a modern RTX card, NVIDIA's optics library is about 1,000 times faster.
Right.
Okay, I've got. I was quite proud of my little GPU ray tracer for many years, but
Right.
it's like things have moved on.
Okay.
So I can now go from, basically it was taking 10, 20 seconds to render
Right.
a frame of my stuff before. 1,000 times faster. It's now interactive.
Wow.
And in particular, doing things interactive where you're doing like X-ray like views into the inside the structure and things like that. And I'm now seeing things in data which I might have created 5, 10 years ago, but by visualizing it differently, I'm seeing new things. I'm seeing new forms of the structures.
Right.
So it's one thing I'm really actually interested in is it's almost like okay, let's 3D print it, and then you print it, and then you start realizing there's things you weren't even aware of before in there.
Right. Because you could see things from a different point of view. Yeah. Oh,
that's
wow.
sort of 3D printed, like sort of vase-like sort of
Look at all that.
structures.
That's amazing. I'm glad we're doing video of this.
I can show you if I can get to the side. There's my little 3D printer glowing at the background there. And
I can see it.
That sort of ball's actually also a 3D printed
Wow.
sort of structure. Actually, maybe I should bring that up the camera.
Okay, sure. Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Probably got to order some horrible audio things.
That's okay.
That's the 3D printed.
The brain-like
cellular
material.
form.
Yeah.
So, it's a brain-like structure thing, actually printed in 12 different pieces on my 3D printer.
Nice.
So and there's also the challenge of almost like, well, okay, now how do I get that data into a printable form?
Right.
And then you actually print it, and then you realize, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, but sometimes you just think, wow, okay, now I see it.
Mm-hmm.
There's things there I didn't even realize.
Right.
That takes you in a different direction, or even just constraints. Actually, a lot of the vase structures, the things that are up on those shelves.
Right.
And all of the thing behind that was how to modify the rules of the growth system to not force it so that everything's guaranteed to be 3D printable, but almost like bringing 3D printability as being something that could influence how it grows. So basically it was looking at overhang angles and things like that between cells as being one of the main things that limits you whether it's 3D printable or not, and then using that to influence things like the rate of growth of the system.
Interesting.
So different bits will be growing differently depending on how much they are an overhang.
Right.
So the idea was sort of like, I'm not trying to put like a hard engineering constraint in it, but I'm trying to allow the main thing that affects whether it's 3D printable to affect the structure. So hopefully there's
that's your physics rule.
It sort of and it sort of almost means hopefully within the space of structures that could grow, there's a whole bunch of them which are naturally 3D printable.
Right.
And it's a lot of things to play with. So it's almost like having to 3D print it forced me into thinking about, well, what allows it to be 3D printable, and then that is end up going back into the system, and hopefully ends up making some even more interesting structures and forms. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is really cool because I've been thinking about this for a while of your work, and then I saw your post. Was it last week? I think maybe the week before that you posted a research paper you did on deep learning and aesthetic decision making, shall we say? Is that what did you call it?
Yeah, that works. Yeah.
Okay. And it's fascinating, and I could totally see, because obviously you're creating tons and tons and tons and tons of iterations of your stuff, right? Because it's constantly creating new things, right? Constantly creating new shells, new shapes, new ideas, and you realize that from a human point of view, you, like you were mentioning before, in nature, like there's certain things do you find more appealing or less appealing, right? You understand that. And you helped, you're one of the co-authors in this paper about this. Can you, why don't you explain to people what this paper was about and how it came about? Because it's really fascinating.
Okay, I actually might go a little bit more of the backstory.
Yeah, let's do that.
Almost
Yeah.
like what's taken me down the road towards that, which I guess, as I was saying, Lee, originally was this running joke. Let's do all the things that you're not allowed to be paid to do professionally.
Right.
And I've now sort of come more back a bit to the point of almost like a more interesting point is how to work creatively with these almost like rich out of control systems.
Right.
So I don't just want to press the button and just randomly does stuff.
Right.
I want to be involved influencing. Actually, steering is almost over control. It's almost like sort of a right level of control. So I want to be, how do I actively explore what this can do and then sort of influence it to things that I'm particularly interested in,
Right.
but without over controlling it, without over directing it. I don't want to. So I want to. It's almost what I want to do is I want to be able to make the system almost as out of control as possible, but
Right.
still creatively influence it.
You want to be a good
it.
parent, it sounds like.
Yeah. Actually, yeah. It's almost like I want the child to already be a teenager.
Yep. Excellent.
As out of control as possible. Then you need to bring them back.
Yeah.
And also just the number of parameters in the system. It's all of these things where too many controls, and you start being the point where I guess one of my big things is work often is saying that these sorts of systems often have places where the really interesting behavior happens. There's often like a transition place, a place where one behavior is turning into a different behavior, and where the typical's happening, it's sort of interesting, but not that interesting.
Right.
And often the really, surprising stuff happens at these tipping points where one behavior turns into another behavior thing. So basically it's how to explore, how to work with systems that are really out of control, but how to be able to still be a human in the loop, still be able to influence the system, still be able to work with it. So that's become a big part of my art side is how do I stay in the loop rather than just setting the computer off. And so I've been working on almost half of what I've been working on Software Rise for the last 10 years has actually been on that question. How do I work with this? So one of the most recent things with that is I've been working with John McCormack, who if you haven't had on CD Garage, he's actually a really, really interesting guy.
Oh, okay. Definitely put me in touch with him.
Computational artist, professor at Monash University, who runs a group called Sensi Lab down at Monash, which is about use of technology for creative use with all sorts of broad ideas within that. And he invited me to go down there last year, spend a few weeks at Monash, and sort of from that, it was something I was almost wanting to work in. This is the right opportunity to say, okay, well, one thing I've been wanting to do for a long time is current sort of deep neural nets, things that can be trained to recognize and categorize, and okay, a lot of it's saying it's Siamese cat versus tabby cat,
right. Yep.
Driving a car and things. Can we use deep neural nets to help us as humans, not take over, but actually help us navigate these spaces, find things more actively, help us explore? Right. So that's basically what this research has been about. Is I suppose core idea, I guess, is saying that the behavior, these systems typically have lots of different behaviors, and categorizing those behaviors is almost like a really useful way to then almost define what it means to look for the boundary. It's almost like first of all, it's almost like categorize the behaviors so that they can then say, well, when you're moving from one behavior to another one, or when you're finding something which your system that's got very used to categorizing behaviors can't categorize it, it's surprised, it doesn't know what this is.
Right.
So it's almost like categorizing is a quite human thing to do, but can we be assisted to make that process even almost playful? It's almost what I want to do is give it as few examples as possible. Just say this thing I think looks, I could say that thing,
right.
Me and Chris, we've agreed that looks a bit like a brain.
Yeah.
Yep. Maybe I've got another thing that looks a bit like broccoli. There's another thing that looks like, we sort of categorize these. Could I just give it as few examples as possible?
Yeah.
and then let it go off and hopefully find the crazy hybrid, the thing where, you know, it's almost deliberately finding the points in the space where one behavior is turning into a different behavior.
Right.
That hopefully makes sense. That's the core of what we do. So it's almost like make that process of categorizing as easy as possible, because I don't want to hand categorize 10,000 things,
Yeah,
and then
that
actually use that data to find those transition places.
so this is an interesting thing. If you think about what deep learning is, obviously it goes through and it processes tens of thousands of things, right? And what you're trying to do is saying, I want to process a few things and have it process the rest of the things for me based on what it learned, as little as possible, right?
Yeah, but hopefully get to the point where it can divide the space up into meaningful categories.
Right. What did you describe it as in the video I saw? Like user fatigue or something? What was it?
Hmm.
Yeah, it was like,
That's actually not my name. That's actually there's quite a technique that's been used for many years. Is what's
uh-huh.
called uh, interactive genetic algorithms, IGAs.
Right.
So it's using ideas of mutation and crossbreeding and things like that. This became really trendy in the 90s.
Okay.
So that's just really cool computer art from back then that used interactive genetic algorithms.
Wow.
So basically using um, you know genetic algorithm techniques of I've got data and with rules for how I go from a genotype to a phenotype, but as computer data. But then using things a bit like evolution ideas, the idea of I can mutate and crossbreed things together, and
Hmm.
then the things which are somehow scored as being the fittest are the ones that survived and produce the offspring for the next generation. And the
Right.
idea of doing it for an art things, where I'm just looking at things saying I like that, don't like that, and the ones that I've said I like are the ones that get the parents for the next generation.
Right.
So it's it's a really fascinating idea. It's like stealing from nature to
Okay.
do art things. And people have exhibitions in galleries where you depending on how long people spent in front of which video screen would we be using to determine which ones people most liked, and the ones that most people most liked would then get the ones that would get most spread and things like
Right.
that.
Right. 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 Right.
But one problem that people have identified with these sort of systems is that it becomes very tiring. You can do it often 10 minutes, half an hour, and then you just get really bored.
Yes.
It's just like, and especially if you can't really see where it's going. I take all these things, and
I
then it's
know
like,
from
okay,
my old
yeah,
days in Lightroom, trying to process like 100,000 pictures and trying to figure out how to tag them all. Like, ugh,
yeah,
that's tedious and horrible.
tedious and horrible.
Yeah.
User fatigue. Posh research speech for tedious and horrible.
Right. Yeah. So basically you're trying to figure out like how to train the system by giving it as few inputs as possible and have the deep learning process do the rest of the categorization for you based on its best guess. Is that how it works basically?
So that's sort of the first half of it. Yeah, the idea is that just for instance, I put stuff into my software. It's called Species Explorer
Right.
ages ago to have the idea of categories,
Hmm.
and then potentially I could then use those categories to do things like define fitness as being probability of being brain-like multiplied by probability of being broccoli-like, and an
Right.
area of the space which is as a high value of that multiplied by that is potentially a hybrid and things like that. So
Right.
you've got things in there to be the idea of let's use categories to actively try to find places where hybrid. The reality of it, though, was the user fatigue. You'd often only after generating a few thousand of these things start to sort of see the categories,
Right.
and it's just then really tedious going through 1,000 things, going that's a broccoli, that's a broccoli, that's a broccoli, that's a broccoli.
Yeah.
And also, potentially even more, is that you want to be playful with it. You want to maybe put things into categories really quickly, so that you can then go, actually, maybe let's change it. Let's do the categories differently. Let's do this.
Right.
Whereas if you've spent ages categorizing 1,000 things, the last thing you then want to do is just to then go, actually, maybe if I change it, maybe if I take that category and divide it into another 3 categories, or maybe combine those two together. And you want to be able to playfully be playful. You want to make the process of making categories as easy as possible
Right.
and as quick as possible, both to put things in categories and modify and change them around.
Right.
And then hopefully what you've then got is really useful basically just data that the computer can use for things a bit like evolutionary genetic algorithms, or actually even with evolutionary genetic algorithms, but you can also use other potential machine learning things, can almost then use that data so that you can then sort of set it off a bit like a sort of like, sniffer dog to go, you go, computer, now you go and try and find the thing that you can't categorize, or try and find the thing that really does appear to be at a point of transition between the different categories. So in some ways I think that's the even more interesting thing, is the how to find those transitions, but you also then need the right data.
So that would be kind of almost identifying the mutations in a lot of ways, right?
Well, it's actually particularly finding the things where the computer gets confused, I guess. I mean, a lot of these machine learning systems, they go, that's a Siamese cat.
Mm-hmm.
As you dig one or two layers deeper, up in the neurons,
right,
before that final layer where it's gone Siamese cat,
right.
Often these things have probability measures where actually what it's got is it's saying it's 92% thinks it's Siamese cat,
right.
5% thinks it's tabby, 7% thinks it's a fern,
right,
whatever.
Right.
So it's often they've got these probabilities, and so you can get the idea of confusion, the idea of, where is it confused?
Mm.
And actually, is that something that's interesting? So it's almost like it's all sort of different. So this is ongoing research. That's one area that we're interested in. It's almost like saying, after you've trained it, if I'm interested in novelty, I'm not interested in it. It just categorizing is almost like the tool. What I'm really interested in is new things.
Right.
Surprise me.
Now,
so surprising me might be almost sort of the equivalent of surprise me in machine learning terms, maybe saying it's got a high confusion level.
Right.
That's when it doesn't understand what it's looking at. Okay, now show that to me. I'm interested in seeing what the computer can't make sense of.
But because you're creating these systems that are unpredictable, right? And that by design. But at the same time, in order to generate this, there's parameters that you must be entering, obviously, into these systems to generate whatever they're happening. So, is the deep learning algorithm correlating the parameters with the decision-making category or whatever is going on as well? So it's like, if I move this parameter, I'm more likely to get this category or this whatever. Is that something that it does?
That's sort of next steps. I mean, what we're already doing is we're using the machine learning to potentially score. It was like fitness score, whether actually what we've got is categories, and also this paper was it also I'd looked at everything and saying, just subjectively, oh, that's rubbish. I'll get that a 2. I'll get that a 0. I'll get that a 0. That's a 4.
Right.
Whoa, that's an 8.
Right.
That's a 9. That's to 10. Oh, I've run out of category numbers. That's an 11. I want 11. So I was giving everything just subjective numbers.
Right.
Where this and it is very subjective. Just me looking at going, those two almost look the same, but that's a 5 and that's a 7.
Right.
I just think they are.
Right.
I might come back tomorrow and think otherwise.
Yeah.
So I guess we were getting the computer to actually surprisingly accurately, I think, agree with my ratings as well.
Interesting.
So what we can do is we can use that to almost like choose new parameters. So it's almost like you could try, almost like the computer randomly chooses 100,000 parameters, but we've got some way of maybe having an estimate, a prediction. To start with, it's probably going to be an awful prediction, but as it goes on, it's hoping to get better and better prediction of that new set of parameters. What prediction is it that I'm going to like it or not?
Right. And then does it categorize you as a person and your taste versus someone else's as a person and their taste?
Well, the data it's using is all just things I've rated.
Sure, but you could say, give Chris as many 7 or above things that he likes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you would go and look for different things. I mean, I often find things which I think some other people find really quite disgusting.
Right.
I agree. I like to look at it, sort of think of, this is completely pure computer data. I'm often running things. They're just white bubbles rendered with ambient occlusion
Right.
generally.
Yep.
Pure computer data, but people look at it and go, well, that's really disturbing.
Right.
I think that's quite interesting.
It is strange that you're looking basically at a math equation represented visually, and you have a
Yeah,
feeling of disgust. It's a completely emotional response to a mathematical equation.
exactly, absolutely. Which I think gets to a point where, yeah, and then the human in the loop, the thing that feels that reaction.
Right.
So some other people might not really not like things that I look at and go, well, I'm going to give that a 9 because I'm really interested in it. I think it
Right.
looks quite. It's just, I mean, it surprised me, and yeah, okay. So I'm almost maybe steering it towards those points in space. So basically, what we're doing is we're using these. I've actually got a number of different techniques that can be used to generate the next set of parameters. And machine learning can feed into that in a number of ways.
Hmm.
So one thing that we haven't done yet, but we're planning to do is, depending on the machine learning algorithm you're using, some of them you can get meaningful gradients in the
Mm.
space. Now, how meaningful they are can depend. That's a genuine research we've still got to do.
Right.
But there are ideas of we could do what's called gradient descent methods and things like that in these spaces and see what work on gradients where, or you could just say, I deliberately want to, from this point of space, move as fast as possible towards maximizing the probability of being in a different category and things like that. There are things where by being in a machine learning framework, you
Yeah.
can start doing things like that. So yeah, this is very much ongoing work, but
Yeah.
that's whereas without that, you tend to just be randomly sampling points and looking at them. Yeah, the point where you can just say, I've not only got a prediction of what the category will be at this point in space, but I've also got a prediction of what the likelihood of being in a different category is as you move in different directions.
Right. Now,
That
this research is amazing, and I love the idea of it, and I love the what it's doing. I also have this amazing feeling that I love it because I don't necessarily see right now a direct correlation to something practical that it can do, because I think
it can
that's
make crazy things.
yes. Well, I think that's great because then in a lot of ways it's freeing you of being able to do needing to make it practical, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that allows you to just keep going and going and going. Do you do you feel like maybe there's a practical thing and maybe I should like somehow turn this into something practical? Or do you like the fact that you can just do whatever you want with it in a sense?
I like playing.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah,
good.
I was for a few years. I was a tutor at the Bartlett, which is basically UCL, University College London's
Hmm.
architecture school,
Oh
which
yeah,
is this um,
very good school.
very very theoretical. I
Yeah,
mean,
very
it's got a
theoretical. Yep.
bit of a reputation of once every few years somebody comes up with something that looks like a building.
Right. Yep.
A lot of their stuff is, I think, actually beautifully abstract and things like that.
Hmm.
But they're within architecture engineering. I mean, the idea of generative systems feeding into things and also biology ideas feeding into engineering, bio-inspired, biomimetic. Um, I think there is potential of quite a lot of this stuff in that sort of space.
Right.
Actually, in some ways, particularly, it's the I think there's a thing of really interesting, rich systems. Also, engineering, like I said, maybe just oversimplifying things a lot. A lot of
Sure.
engineering is about finding a lot of very, very simple components that you completely understand, and then
Right.
you assemble things out of those, the same components that you have completely understood what they do. Biology works in completely different ways. It's almost more like this systems of, where you can mix together, all sorts of different amounts of what's called chitination, how much hardness is put into something can make everything from skin to nails to bone to cartilage by mixing and matching different things and having these complex rules for then how you then assemble this material that can have all sorts of different material properties, and it's the structures and things that you're creating. You've almost got a palette that you can make a really complex, interesting behavior, but it's really difficult to understand. It's really difficult to direct it. So I do think there is a practical thing of some of these ideas potentially get into, well, with those sorts of systems, maybe what you don't want to do is dumb the system down too much. You want the system still to be rich, almost there, totally out of control.
Right.
But to be able to steer it. So it's almost like how to work with complex, rich ingredient systems, which are much more like the sorts of things that nature uses than what we as humans usually use, because we sort of tend to control things. To control things, you want predictable behavior.
Right.
But predictable behavior maybe has lost a lot of the potentialities.
So you bring up an interesting point, because there's now in the world of architecture, and a lot of it came from schools like Bartlett and stuff like that, where people really got interested in parametric systems for design, right? So Grasshopper, I'm sure you're familiar with Grasshopper as a system, and now a lot of people are using Grasshopper for their design process in architecture. It's very popular, right? The problem is everything looks like it was designed in Grasshopper now, because they all seem to be using the same parameters because they're not exploring the software enough. And all these facades that I'm seeing is like, that looks like it was designed in Grasshopper, and it looks very similar to other things. So I'm almost thinking about the way that, your software works, where you can say, hey, instead of just using that, how about finding a new category, something unique, something that's expressive, or something in another way that seems like if you're going to give this power of generative design to people, especially in the architecture world, how do you make it so it has a unique flavor, and it's not basically just looks like the same thing? Because it seems ridiculous that something that is parametric looks like everything else that's parametric.
Yeah, I think there's always this, by being parametric, the system itself will probably have some natural sorts of things that it tends to do,
right.
Or there are limits of what you can do with those parameters and things. Actually, one of the running jokes when I was at the Bartlett was whenever a student would show something that had been created parametrically, and,
right.
And so this is the optimal solution, and I'm going, no, it isn't.
Right. Yep.
It's sort of like, that's a good solution from that particular system,
right?
But in any way calling that optimal, to always like, because you passed this through a box that says optimizer on it,
right,
doesn't mean that you have come up with the optimal solution.
Yes, thank you.
So there's students rapidly learn the
and architecture
when I was around.
I went to Rice Architecture School, so I was an architect as well, and they had very similar things. And this is back in the 90s when chaos was very popular, and then architects were basically just borrowing from math and terms that they had no idea what they were talking about. Like as a math person, I just used to bang my head against the wall when they were saying, this is based on imaginary numbers. I'm like, do you even know what that means? It's like, how does the square root of -1 have anything to do with what you just showed me? And they're like, what do you mean? It's like, imaginary numbers I think you just like the term imaginary. That doesn't make it imaginary numbers.
Yeah, which actually, you give over that. I actually think that the word imaginary was one of the worst namings of any concept in mathematics.
Yeah, yes.
It's it's basically, it's just like a way of doing maths in a 2D plane.
Right.
That's it. It's two-dimensional mathematics. If you call it that, it sounds boring, doesn't it? 2D maths.
Right.
So I think there's actually another thing with Bartlett. There's this. Yes, the philosophy of parametricism. The running joke was that the group I was in, we started calling everything just attributes, or
right.
I was like, just saying, because you've got something that has attributes doesn't mean that you are necessarily subscribing to the whole philosophy of parametricism.
Right.
Just because you've got a system that's parametrically run on parameters,
right,
isn't the same as parametricism as a.
And very popular in the 90s also was talking about architecture as being topological. I'm like, you mean the study of maps, because that's what topological means, or study of mapping. But it's like, because they do just see the basically the picture on the cover of the book of a topology book, and they would see a Klein bottle or some kind of a other object, mostly Klein bottles or knots, the trefoil knots, and they're like, topological. It's like, well, it's a pretty picture on the book of the cover of the math book, but it's not what topology means.
So I'm a great believer. Again, more like Turing-like sort of thing. I mean, the ability of a computer to potentially generate everything, almost like anything that is computable.
Yes.
If you have enough memory, you could compute. It's almost like the astonishing blank canvas. I mean, all the Church-Turing hypothesis that anything that we can compute is probably the same as what even the simplest computer could compute.
Right.
As long as it had enough memory. So the range of possibilities is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
I think people are often very limited by current tools, or using becoming copying what has already been done and slightly changing.
Right.
I think there's things like Grasshopper as being the tool that potentially could do anything, but then there are the dangers of becoming too much just within the style. I mean, people at Bartlett look at everything. It's like, it's the Voronoi plugin for Grasshopper again.
Yes. Yep.
Stop it.
Yep.
There's the overuse of the current flavor.
Yeah.
Again, but what this system is potentially capable of is so enormous.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost frightening, which is where I think that ideas of saying how does almost like nature's the existence proof of you can work with astonishingly complex systems and come up with amazingly surprising results. I'm not saying that nature does everything in a perfect way at all. I absolutely think the opposite. Actually, I think that nature is was a great categorization of nature is making astonishingly good use of amazingly bad design again and again. It's just like, you've done what?
Yep.
With what? Why?
Yeah.
Your optic nerve comes out from through the front of your retina.
Right.
Really?
Yeah.
That's
right where you should be.
Crazily stupid.
You should have more rods there, and instead you have a big black hole.
Exactly, because your wiring comes out through the wrong direction. Oh, yeah, really bad original design, and you couldn't fix it.
Yep.
But it does show, it shows, at least it shows up a glimmer of the possibilities.
Right. Yeah, I think it's wonderful. I think, when I see your work and I hear you talk about it, it just brings me back to me thinking about, honestly speaking, when I was a math major in college and I would take classes like abstract algebra, topology, etc., I would go back to my room and I would, I couldn't shut off my brain. It was so wonderful to sit there and imagine all these things. It was just hard to understand. I remember when I was first trying to understand, I was very young and I was like, how do you represent four-dimensional space in 3 dimensions? And it was, then you start to realize like, oh, well, I'm just taking a camera that does 3D and takes it to 2D, and I just apply it one more dimension. And then just thinking about that was really freeing. And it was just like, and when I talk to you and I hear all the stuff you're doing, and I love how you're like trying to basically design a system that's completely out of control, and loving it.
As I put unruly.
Unruly.
I like the idea of, it was almost like having the unruly companion.
Right.
You don't want to over-tame, but you need to semi-tame.
Yes. Yeah, that's really, really cool. I think it's really great. And I really definitely think that you should check out some of Scott's work, because it's really incredible. And I'll send you some links of some of his talks about behavior, because I think you guys would get along. And at some point when lockdown subsides, at some point you guys should definitely get together and exchange some ideas. But listen, we've gone over an hour, and it's been a fascinating conversation. This is the kind of stuff that gets me excited. And I love your work. I love the paper you wrote as well, and I'm going to put a link to people to follow that as well. Is there a written form of it as well that people can check out? Okay.
Yeah. Actually, I'll send you the email. Yeah, John's put it up on ArcViz. So yeah, it's a freely accessible online version of the paper.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Hopefully, it's almost in English. Though it's in a combination between Brit English and Aussie English.
Aussie, okay.
John's Australian.
Two different Englishes. Yes, that's true. All right. Well, thank you so much, Andy. Appreciate it.
Okay, it's a pleasure.